to talk about not just your experience and your journey as a serial entrepreneur, as a maker, as a creator, but also this notion of what are going to be the jobs of the present and the future, and being able to really understand what that means in e-commerce. And so, Brian, I want to let you go ahead and dive in here, and ask some of the first questions.
Thank you. Neil, it's great to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
You've been a CIO, a CTO, a technology leader now for, as Benji said in your intro, for many, many years. And I guess I'm just kind of interested in your view on kind of this inflection point. AI is certainly not new. We've been using AI to drive optimization, to drive personalization, to, interrogate data and use it both in commerce, marketing, and across a wide spectrum really of the economy. But now, of course, we're really suddenly talking about it all the time.
Yep.
And it seems suddenly both very fast and very urgent to really have discussions about the impact on business, on society, on culture. So I'm interested in how you look at that, because obviously you've been working with data and AI now for decades.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating time. AI, I think, has really exploded into public consciousness, and I give the OpenAI guys just a ton of credit for making it so tangible for people and letting them be able to touch and imagine what AI could actually do. Meanwhile, we've been working with these technologies for a long time. I wrote my first neural network in 1988. It was tiny.
It was a tiny neural network.
It took forever to train. We had no data. It was kind of awful, but it worked, sort of.
Is that like an ant neural network?
I think that's insulting ants. Basically, it was like a 128 node 3-layered network, and it was a toy. But all those concepts have really carried forward. And, what's really happened is, of course, the technology has moved forward, and there have been tons of really meaningful developments there. But more importantly, we now have enough data and enough compute to actually make it.
And cloud sort of storage and compute to make these things happen.
Exactly, yeah. So the just ready availability of GPUs and CPUs, storage, and then just the huge pool of data that's out there to train LLMs and other models has really catapulted us forward. There are a couple of things that are really interesting to me. One is, even though we have a vast amount of data, the data is sort of just a small slice.
Yeah.
And, a lot of it, very prominently has been scraped from Reddit and other public internet sites. And so it has all the issues that those sites have. And so we're dealing with a very particular vantage point on the world based on that. So, one of the things I think is going to be super important over the course of the coming cycle is figuring out how we create better data sets that don't have sort of the quirks and biases and honestly errors that you see in the current data. And I think a big part of that is going to be, as companies really embrace LLMs in particular, you start with a baseline LLM, you feed it a bunch of data to support your application, as Bloomreach is doing. But then, we're looking at building sort of refinement loops into that, where you both add additional data that's cleaned and tuned properly, and then you basically take various forms of human and machine feedback to kind of nudge you closer and closer to the right answer. So I think that's going to be a huge characteristic is, better data management, better human reinforcement and sort of editing of data. And I think that'll pick up speed and we'll see models that are much more accurate and predictable over time.
As you're talking, I was also thinking about all of the things that are necessary
Mhm.
in order to refine this data,
Yep.
to interpret it better. In our last conversation with Dr. Chowdhury, we just talked about even the responsibility to really understand
Yeah.
either potential great parts and maybe the potential not so great parts.
Mhm.
And it makes me think a lot about the kind of skill sets and talent
Mhm.
now companies have to think about, who are going to be the ones defining how those processes and systems work to clean up that data,
Yep.
ask bigger questions about, well, what kind of data do we need to start capturing now?
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how these jobs, but particularly what even talent in these spaces are going to need to know and to learn,
Yeah.
and to have kind of as part of their acumen
Yep.
and knowledge, as we're starting to look at LLMs in a very different way?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting question. I kind of view AI as power tools for intellectuals, basically. Like,
Mhm.
you know, back in the 16th century, as a carpenter, you could make beautiful stuff with a
Mhm.
chisel and a handsaw, but it took a really long time and you had to develop all of these skills. We're kind of in that same place with computing where LLMs now start to become like modern battery operated power tools where you can do stuff faster, um, to very high quality standards with somewhat less kind of repetition and skill building. So the thing that's really important is, people moving into this era still really need to understand all of the principles and the architectures. And I think what's going to happen is you're going to kind of pop up a level. So, I've been programming forever, and a ton of software engineering is quite literally insert tab A into slot B kind of programming. And one of the things that I've been playing around with is having LLMs write a lot of that sort of plumbing and foundational stuff.
Mhm.
It's really good at it. It's not perfect. I have to go in and fix stuff all the
Mhm.
time, but it probably saves 70%
But
of the
you're editing and you're debugging
right.
versus like grunt work coding.
Exactly.
And I think that's really interesting, which can drive productivity gains,
It can.
Mhm.
especially for things that are highly routinized,
Yep.
right? Which I think is really interesting, and it also is, in a sense, a great way to democratize all of the sort of uh, you know
hmm
documentation and all of the resources that developers would have to understand inside of a certain language and what have you that they're coding in. Now they can even code in what they're familiar with and use these tools to just translate it into a different coding language,
Mm.
or just ask in a very natural language way for help to solve a problem as they're working. There's all
Yeah,
these kinds of ways that can have an impact.
that's true. But there's one really important point is unless you understand how software works and you can actually
Mhm.
ask the question correctly, um, you hit a limit pretty
Yeah.
quickly,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So, the thing that's been fascinating for me is, I can describe the data structure and the transformation and the service I'm trying to plug into in, very programmer centric terms, and the
Mhm.
LLM's like, I got you.
Yeah.
And here we go.
Yeah.
Where, if you just say, write
Yeah.
me something to scrape this off the
Yeah.
following website,
Yeah.
you'll get something, but it may or may not be right.
Yeah, great,
So,
right.
and I think this is actually a really important characteristic of this iteration.
Mhm.
These LLMs have been trained from, GitHub and Stack Exchange. And so, they've learned to program from programmers.
Mhm.
I think over time, you'll see that abstraction level go up.
Mhm.
But right now, at least in my experience, and I'm not claiming like full expertise in this, but it's much better if I think of the LLM as a junior programmer
Right.
Mhm.
rather than being, just kind of a complete black box.
Well, even the analogy that GitHub uses around the Copilot is the good one, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, they're there to help support,
Perfect.
but you're still driving. Right?
Exactly.
I think is a
Mhm.
good analogy to think about. So I know you're an operating partner versus an investing partner
Yes.
at Shasta,
Mhm.
but you're obviously very close to sort of evaluating the thesis for new investment opportunities that might come Shasta's way, and really thinking about that. And I think every venture capital firm out there is just inundated with pitches from companies that are startups that are trying to raise money, whether it's seed A or B rounds, to go after a Gen AI or an AI based business. And I guess I'm just, because I'm sure this is where you come in to those types of conversations. How do you vet what is real and what isn't? How do you actually like understand the opportunity and separate the use cases from like a technology in search of something to go solve?
Yeah, I think it's a problem everybody's wrestling with right now. So I actually usually start at the use case and try to develop an opinion on how broadly applicable it is, what the level of commercial interest is, and then how you would actually connect with customers on it, because a lot of stuff is difficult to describe in your go-to-market pitch. Like, how do I explain to my prospective customers what the benefit is and why they should pay for it? So I've, even before AI, technology to me is a tool that lets you get a job done, and it always starts from understanding, what's the job to be done.
Yeah.
Exactly. and why it's valuable, and why this is better than any of the alternatives. And, in a lot of cases, sure, you could do it with AI, but there are other ways to do it that may or may not be better, but, for a variety of reasons, may be preferable. Cost is an issue with AI, especially with consumer applications. You can run up a huge OpenAI bill really quickly. And if you're running your own models, AWS will run up your credit card really quickly. So, so you have to think about the cost of providing the service versus other approaches. Kind of getting farther down into the technology side, one thing I'm very attuned to is whether this is sort of a veneer on top of an LLM, or whether there's actually some
proprietary something. Yeah.
And sometimes it's not just a technology question, but I've seen a couple of companies that are creating really interesting frameworks for solving business problems that are enabled by AI, where it's an important component, but the secret sauce, if you will, is really having a deep understanding of the problem and a point of view and a framework that lets you get there. Honestly, I haven't looked very carefully at what I would call core AI, OpenAI level model generation and stuff like that. I've mostly been more on the application side at this point. I think there's a ton of interesting work to be done in tooling. As I mentioned in the panel earlier, I think, being able to get your data into the right shape to be consumed by AI is super important. I think creating those human feedback loops is important. And you're just going to see such rapid innovation in all types of models, but particularly in LLMs, that I think it's going to be desirable to be able to kind of route to the right LLM for the problem, basically. So those sort of tooling layers, I think, are pretty interesting.
And I think inside industry verticals as well. Like here we're talking about digital commerce and digital marketing. That's an industry vertical. It's a huge opportunity to improve the business process and solve like a whole host of problems that are industry specific. But you think about other industries, financial services, travel, B2B, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Businesses that understand the problems and the business process that's going on, and how to help organizations save money, but also drive growth or user engagement inside those verticals. Like that's another level of, I think, enterprise solutioning that we haven't really seen yet.
I agree. I think the really key thing for both companies and entrepreneurs to think about is, how do you structure the problem you're trying to solve? And how can how can you create something that's a framework
Mhm.
that a variety of tools can interact with better,
Mhm.
AI certainly being a great example, but being able to create instrumentation and data pipelines that
Yep.
that kind of really understand what your business is doing is key. And a great example of that is the revolution in digital marketing, and being able to see how your message was being received,
Yes.
and the whole funnel all the way through to purchase.
Right.
I mean, that really changed the way marketers
That's right.
and
Made
merchandisers
it data
work.
driven.
Exactly. And there are still tons of industries out there that are not to that level
Right.
of being so sort of process and data driven. So there are lots of opportunities there.
Well, it has been such a pleasure to have you, Neil.
Thank
you. And are you sticking around for the rest of the conference?
Unfortunately, I have to jump in the car and go meet my son and his friend. I wish
Neil's
I
got
could
big
stay.
plans. Neil's
I've
got
got
big plans.
Why isn't AI able to take care of that for you?
Right.
Well, I'm a big fan of experiences and in-person things, and I hope it never replaces that for sure.
Yes. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And just sharing your knowledge and your expertise, and let people know also like where they can find you.
I'm Neil at Shasta.vc. Feel free to email me, and would love to connect. So great.
Wonderful.
Thanks so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.